Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for our annual commemoration of the 1871 Los Angeles Chinese Massacre. Before we begin, here are some things that you may need to know. The program will be recorded for archival purposes and will be posted publicly for viewing in the future. Please keep your microphone and your video off during the duration of the program. For the best experience, we ask all participants to choose speaker view. And if you'd like to view the program with closed captioning, please go to the red live button on the top left corner of your screen and click on the arrow next to onotter.ai live notes. From there, please click view stream on otter.ai live notes for closed captions. I'd like to acknowledge the board and our advisory council members who are logged on today and also at the Chinese American Museum. Each year, the Chinese American Museum marks the anniversary of one of the most heinous acts of racially motivated violence to take place in the city of Los Angeles. As a museum that focuses on preserving and sharing the Chinese American experience, it is often a known historical event is one that we are respectfully obliged to recognize and reflect upon. The event that took place in 1871 occurred in the streets near our present-day museum and will forever be a somber reminder of the racial divides of the not-so-distant past. Today, we reflect on those divides as many parallels can be drawn in today's racial climate. While anti-Asianness arises during the worldwide pandemic and Black, Indigenous, and people of color continue to push for equality, we can learn from today's commemoration the faults of our history so that these events cease to repeat. Throughout the program, you've been hearing from several individuals who will help us understand the importance of commemorating this tragedy, including U.S. Congressmember Judy Chau, California State Assemblymember Chau, a Pueblo Commissioner, President David Louie, a Pueblo General Manager Arturo Chavez. Providing historical knowledge of the Los Angeles Chinese Massacre is FCAM board member Eugene. I'd also like to welcome our special guests for the evening, Rebecca Ware and Amy Xu, representing Artists at Play, who will be presenting a single scene from the play The Chinese Lady, written by Laura Suh. Our program will conclude with words and a moment of reflection from FCAM board member and president, Dr. Gay Yuen, with the readings of the names of the individuals killed. She's on site at the Chinese American Museum and will also lead us with a wreath laying and bow ceremony in front of the plaque placed into the sidewalk of the museum, detailing the history of the massacre. The Chinese American Museum is situated in the Pueblo de Los Angeles Historical Monument. Our first speaker tonight is someone who has respectfully taken on the stewardship of preserving and safeguarding the city's birthplace and culturally diverse heritage. As the general manager of all of our Pueblo, in which CAM is embedded in, he recognizes the commemoration not only because of its importance to the museum, but its importance to the history of Los Angeles. Please welcome Pueblo General Manager Arturo Chavez.
Thank you, Michael, and welcome everybody to Pueblo, Los Angeles. I want to commemorate and congratulate the Chinese American Museum, CAM, as we know, and the Friends of America, Chinese American Museum for undergoing such difficult times with COVID and being able to still program and recognize this horrific event that happened in the history of Los Angeles, many of which documents indicate it's a forgotten history, but for us, it will never be forgotten. I think that one of the major problems that we're having in this administration now is that an uptick in the hate crimes that have occurred throughout the nation, and particularly here in Los Angeles. A recent report from the Los Angeles County Human Relations Board indicated that there was an uptick of up to 38% in crime for hate crimes in the county of Los Angeles, and of which there was an uptick of 32% in the API community. We need to understand that these continued hate crimes remind us of the horrific massacre that occurred in 1871 here in the Chinese community. And the program today is only a reminder to make sure that we do not forget, that we continue to commemorate And we continue to remember those victims of this tragic event, born again out of continued racism, and many of which is an uptick, like I've indicated earlier. I want to welcome everyone here today at El Pueblo. As Michael has indicated, the El Pueblo Historic Monument is the landmark for the birthplace of Los Angeles and the um, home to CAM, Chinese American Museum. We celebrate the diversity of what is Los Angeles. We want to make sure that we allow for all programming to continue. And I want to congratulate you once again for putting this together. And it is an honor to be participant in the program today, commemorating those that we lost in 1871. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your words, and thank you for joining us tonight, Arturo. Next, I am honored to welcome someone who has been a long-term friend and supporter of the museum. Her vocalness towards squelching anti-Asianists here and throughout the nation brings our community great honor and pride. We deeply value her participation in tonight's commemoration. Please welcome U.S. Representative for California 27th Congressional District, the Honorable Judy Chau.
Good evening. Thank you to the Chinese American Museum for organizing this event today to ensure that even despite the coronavirus pandemic, we are able to take time to gather virtually so we never forget the tragedy of the 1871 Los Angeles Chinese Massacre. It was 149 years ago, on a cold day in 1871, that the ugliest brutality in Los Angeles history resulted in the Chinese Massacre. It started as an argument between two Chinese Tongs about a Chinese woman. A white man who tried to intervene was accidentally killed. Because of that, a mob of 500 rushed to the street. They hunted down and shot any Chinese who tried to leave their house or business. Chinese buildings were looted and riddled with bullets. Men, women, and children were dragged out of their homes, trampled by the mob, beaten and hung by their necks. A highly respected Chinese doctor, Dr. Jean Tong, begged in both English and Spanish for his life, offering money and the diamond ring on his finger. But he was given no mercy. The mob stole his money, shot him in the mouth, and chopped off his finger to steal his ring before they hanged him from a noose. They grabbed a frightened young boy, aged 12, who had only been in the country for a month and didn't know a word of English. He was hanged. In the end, 18 Chinese Americans have been tortured and murdered. And yet, of the 500 vigilantes, only 7 were convicted, but their convictions were overturned, and only 1 served any time in jail. In fact, some celebrated the violence. One man who, after the violence was done, and with blood on his hands and shirt, joined the festivities in a bar and said, "Well, I am satisfied now. I have killed 3 Chinamen." This shocking massacre reflected the fact that the Chinese were the scapegoats for the nation's economic problems of the time. This ugly distrust of Chinese immigrants is what led the Congress to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, one of the most discriminatory acts in American history, preventing the Chinese from immigrating, from becoming naturalized citizens, and from ever having the right to vote. Today, this law is gone. Today, we have the expression of regret in Congress for the Chinese Exclusion Act, a resolution I sponsored. But we must never forget the suffering that our earliest pioneers endured for being blamed for the nation's problems. Because today, we're seeing it again in anti-Asian coronavirus hate crimes and incidents. It started in January with dirty looks and misinformation, and has since escalated to spitting, yelling, and physical attacks against Asian Americans all across the nation. Right here in Los Angeles, a 16-year-old boy was sent to the hospital after being attacked by bullies who accused him of having coronavirus simply because he's Asian. In New York, an 89-year-old Asian woman was set on fire while out for a walk in her neighborhood. And another Asian American woman was attacked with acid while she was simply taking out the garbage in front of her home, suffering chemical burns to her face and body. In Texas, a man stabbed an Asian American family of 3, including children's aged 2 and 6, at a Sam's Club. saying that he wanted to exterminate Asian Americans because of the coronavirus. These incidents are not isolated. There have been over 2,900 anti-Asian hate crimes and incidents reported in recent months. This xenophobia has been stoked by President Donald Trump, who's trying to direct anger at China in order to deflect blame for his delayed and failed response to the coronavirus crisis. He and his followers have deliberately and repeatedly used the term Chinese virus, Wuhan virus, and Kung flu to refer to coronavirus, even though the CDC and World Health Organization have repeatedly warned not to associate the disease with a specific geographic location or ethnicity due to the stigma it causes. But despite the harm he knows that this causes AAPIs, Trump refuses to stop. So today's vigil is a reminder about the sacrifices that those 18 Chinese Americans made. But it's also a reminder that today we must use our voice to be vigilant about stereotyping and scapegoating. We must use our voice to ensure that our civil rights are protected. We must work with other fair-minded Americans to make sure that everybody, no matter what their backgrounds, are not bullied or tortured just for being who they are. Today's vigil reminds us all that we must never let this happen again.
Thank you so much for being here tonight, Representative Chau. Your words and your support mean so much to the museum and to our community. It's leaders like you who we commend for being our voice during a time when we need it the most. Thank you for spending your evening with us. Our next guest could not join us live tonight, but has graciously sent his support with a pre-recorded message. As State Assembly member, his commitment to telling the truth about the Chinese American history and education and its significance within a larger American story supports the museum and our efforts to tell the Chinese American experience. I now like to share with you a special pre-recorded message from California State Assembly member, Ed Chau.
Today, we gather to commemorate one of the largest mass lynchings in American history. On this very day, in the year 1871, our country witnessed 17 Chinese men, the youngest one only 15 years old, being tortured, lynched, and hung by a mob of about 500 people. The incident happened during a time period of deep institutional bigotry, racism, and xenophobia against Chinese Americans. We're all familiar with the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was one of the most discriminatory federal laws passed in this country. The law banned Chinese from immigrating to the United States and also from becoming U.S. citizens. Here in California, anti-Chinese sentiments and laws were rampant long before the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. In the year 1854, the California Supreme Court ruled that Chinese were not allowed to testify against the white population, and that law remained on the book for 20 years. Today, we remember the lives of those 17 people from that incident, and we reflect. Yes, the Chinese community here in Los Angeles did recover from the incident. With perseverance, resiliency, we have worked hard, we have grown and made contribution to our society. Yes, our nation is a nation of melting pot that brings together people from all walks of life, people with different identities, cultures, and beliefs. It is that diversity that makes our state and our nation strong. Yet, we must maintain our unique qualities and attributes and heritage. We must remember our history. So thank you very much, Chinese American Museum, Dr. Yuen, and the entire team for helping us preserve, share, and also remembering our history. Thank you for having me.
We would like to once again thank Assemblymember Chau for his words and his office for coordinating with the camp staff to send this message. Next, I'd like to introduce someone who began the commemoration event many years ago. Since he was named president of the Public Commission, he has always been a friend and ardent supporter of CAM. We thank him for being here today and for his continued support of all of our Pueblo. Speaking from us from inside the Chinese American Museum, please welcome President of the Public Commission, David Louie.
When I was young, my dad was in the backyard planting a tree, and he said to me, "My generation plants the trees so that your generation can enjoy the shade." Hi, everybody, and a very pleasant good evening to you wherever you may be. My name is David Louie, and I'm the president of the El Pueblo Historic Monument Authority. On behalf of the City of Los Angeles and El Pueblo, I want to welcome you to the commemoration of the Chinese Massacre of 1871. Several years ago, when I was appointed to the El Pueblo Commission, I was greeted by a board member of the Chinese American Museum. It was my old friend, Al Suhu. He was glad to see me, and he asked how it felt to be on the site of the Chinese Massacre. I responded, "What massacre?" Al smiled and he gave me a brief description of the event. 1871, the Los Angeles economy was poor, the gold rush was over, the Civil War had ended, the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed. There was lots of unemployment in Los Angeles. That's when two Chinese family associations had a disagreement over a woman. Shots were fired and an innocent white man had been killed. Then 500 LA resident vigilantes out of a total population of Los Angeles of about 6,000 descended on Chinatown and shot, stabbed, dismembered, and lynched, killing 18 Chinese men out of a total population of maybe 200. I'm a fourth generation Chinese American, an old guy, been around lots of decades, and I had no idea about the massacre. I was shocked in my ignorance. My family, my friends, my schools had never shared the history of the event. I went home and Googled, started with Wikipedia's few paragraphs, then Munson Kwok's CACA's Statement of Remembrance, and then William Estrada's 8 pages in his book, Alvera Street. And then Scott Zess, The Makings of a Massacre. Heck, there were articles, newspapers, and books that described the event. I came away with an understanding of the sacrifice that those 18 men and boys had made and promised that I would show my appreciation and commemorate their sacrifice. So, 7 a.m., Sunday, October 24th, 2010, I took my 8-year-old son, Bryce, to Father Sarah Park, and the two of us said our words of thanks for their generation's sacrifice so that we could enjoy the shade. Rest in peace, my brothers. Your lives are a blessing and a lesson for us all.
Thank you for joining us, Commissioner President Louie. We will see you again during the wreath ceremony. Here to share some historical knowledge about the 1871 Los Angeles Chinese Massacre is someone our museum is fortunate to have serving on a board for many years. He is adamant about getting the truth out when it comes to the Chinese American experience and is dedicated to preserving this history for future generations. Please welcome local community historian and FCAM board member, Eugene Moy.
Good evening. Los Angeles today is having many community discussions related to race, conflict, and social justice. Tonight also marks the 149th anniversary of one of the most significant events in Los Angeles history. And I'll share a little bit of background, which hasn't already been provided by the preceding speakers. Chinese had been in California during the Spanish and Mexican era in the early 1800s. The American takeover in 1848 and the California gold rush brought immigrants from many lands, including from China. During the 1850s and 1860s, many families in Los Angeles had Chinese household help who worked as cooks, servants, and gardeners. And many Chinese worked as farm laborers in the surrounding area. Some Chinese started their own businesses in the growing downtown of Los Angeles, such as Chun Chik, who opened a store in 1861, and Dr. Chi Long or Jean Tong, who started advertising in the local newspaper in 1870. Dr. Tong, like a good number of other Chinese in California and the West, was a respected herbalist, providing remedies and therapies to support the health of local Chinese Americans, of actually local Americans, period. In addition, Dr. Tong operated an employment agency that brought together Chinese workers with business people, including hotels, restaurants, farms, ranches, and construction contractors. When the first transcontinental railroad was completed in 1869, thousands of Chinese railroad workers sought new work, and probably more than a few ended up in Los Angeles. The 1870 census found 171 Chinese in Los Angeles City proper. 37 LA households employed Chinese domestics. Most of them lived in the Chinese Quarter, south and east of the plaza. And meanwhile, uncounted others lived in the surrounding region. Los Angeles in 1871 was really in transition, ethnically, socially, economically, and politically. California became a state in 1850. LA grew physically and contained a diverse population. There were descendants of early Spanish and Mexican families, including immigrants from France, Germany, England, and many countries. There were migrants from other parts of the US, including Civil War veterans. And by the way, some Chinese served on both sides in the Civil War, all seeking new opportunities. Local government was in place, but not well disciplined. There was locally a lot of gambling, drinking, fighting, shootings were common. Vigilante groups would beat out local justice, including breaking into the city jail and hauling off their hapless victims, innocent or guilty, to a violent hanging or beating. Internal conflicts within all groups, Chinese included, were sometimes settled peacefully and frequently not. Chinese were harassed for being labor competitors, for their race, and for their culture, for being different. So on the afternoon of October 24th, 1871, the shootout between two groups of Chinese just south of the plaza drew the attention of the small LA police force. Officer Jesus Bilderrain was wounded in the crossfire. Local rancher and former saloon owner Robert Thompson attempted to intervene, even though he was told to stay away. He shot into a Chinese store where there was an active shooting scene, got hit by return fire, died an hour later. And as mentioned earlier, in the following couple of hours, an angry mob killed a total of 18 Chinese who were pulled from the Chinese Quarter, shot, beaten, hanged. One of the victims was Dr. Tong, the herbalist and employment agent I mentioned earlier. One was a youth. Other victims were mostly cooks, a storekeeper, and a laundryman. None of the victims were involved in the earlier shooting. So this event of terror hit the newspapers across the nation. LA dutifully called a coroner's inquest. Indictments were made. A trial by jury was made, and 9 men were convicted of manslaughter. All were sentenced for terms of 2 to 6 years, and they were sent to San Quentin prison. However, a year later, all were released due to an alleged technicality in the indictments. So now, 149 years later, we ask if justice was served. Is justice frequently served or often served? Today in Los Angeles, there are continuing questions as to how race and class conflicts and local imbalances, social imbalances, how do these get resolved? Obviously, a lot of public dialogue and negotiation is needed. But tonight, we must recognize and honor the people, the early Angelenos, the human lives who lived and worked in our community and whose names should not and must not be forgotten.
Thank you, Eugene, for sharing the history behind the Chinese Massacre of 1871. We're grateful to have you here with us and know that we can always count on you to express the key moments in history with deep respect and with great compassion. For the next part of the program, we are paired with Artists at Play, a Los Angeles-based theater company that tells the stories of Asian American experiences. Through the main stage production, new play development, and other events, Artists at Play advocates for and collaborates with diverse communities of artists. Representing Artists at Play today is Rebecca Ware. Ms. Ware is a freelance theater director. She directed the West Coast premiere of Laura Su's The Chinese Lady, produced in 2019 by Artists at Play. Thank you, Rebecca, for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Artists at Play and to CAM. I was honored to direct this play last year when it was both the West Coast and Los Angeles premiere. And if you missed the show, you're going to get a chance to see a little bit of Hyung-Suk Kim's costume design and hear a moment of Jesse Mondapot's sound design as well. Before we go into the snippet, I want to give you a little bit of an overview of the piece. So Lloyd Says The Chinese Lady tells the fictionalized story of Afong Moy. She was a real-life woman who was trafficked and brought to New York City in 1834, and she is believed to be the first Chinese diasporic woman in the United States, or at least she's the first one that we have records of. She was exhibited as the quote unquote Chinese lady and was seen as a museum curiosity who demonstrated how she spoke, she ate with chopsticks, and most sensationally, she walked with bound feet for viewers who paid to come see her. The American public was fascinated with her as China was largely unknown at the time, and most Chinese in the United States were actually bachelor laborers. So Lloyd's work first explores the hope and enthusiasm that she brings in hoping to create understanding and knowledge between China and the United States. She really sees herself as a diplomat. But as the years pass, as she becomes older and starts to recognize that she is losing her value, she comes to terms with the fact that she is merely objectified for entertainment. So the scene you're about to see is the final one in the play, and the character of Afong Moy will be played by the wonderful Amy Chau. And now, the scene.
Thank you to Artists at Play for presenting the final scene from The Chinese Lady by Laura Su, directed by Rebecca Ware, and performed live tonight by Amy Chau. Thank you for helping us honor this solemn occasion through a creative and artistic lens. To learn more about Artists at Play, please click on the link in the chat box. Each year, to commemorate and reflect upon the 1871 Los Angeles Chinese Massacre, CAM reads aloud the names of all those who passed in the historic tragedy and lays a floral wreath at the commemorated plaque on Los Angeles Street. To guide us in this year's commemorative traditions, I'd like to introduce the person who helped us define our mission every single day. She is more than a leader for our board and our staff, and selflessly devotes her energy towards our organization and the museum. Please welcome the Friends of the Chinese American Museum Board President, Dr. Yuen.
Good evening. Every year, as I read the names of these 18 victims, I get extremely sad because in essence, they died nameless. And for the Chinese, traditionally, we always have the departed names carved onto plaques to put in the altars and also in the tombstones. Why don't we have the names? Because the names I'm going to be reading tonight are actually handed down to us through research from English newspapers and from court records. However, we don't have the Chinese characters for these names. And therefore, when we don't have the Chinese characters, we don't know what their names are because they're phoneticized. I'm going to do my best every year trying to read the names in Cantonese because we know that the laborers were mostly from the province of Guangdong. However, they could be Toisan, they could be Zhongshan, they could be Cantonese, and therefore we're just doing our best to try to read the names as we can. Wing, Gat, Johnny Bureau, Xin Guai, Leung Guai, Leung, Ji Long Tong Yi Sang, Zheng Wan, Wan Fu, Tong Wan, Lo, Dei Gei, Wa, Ho Heng, Lo Hei, Wan, Wing Chi, Wang Chan. Please hold these names in your heart as we pay our respects to them.
Several board members and key speakers are on site, and we'll be lining up in front of the Chinese American Museum and this plaque to start their wreath laying and bowing ceremony. Please give it a minute as everybody is going to be in position.
I'm going to count in three. I'm going to count 3 times, and we will bow together to pay our respects, and then we'll lay the flowers on the plaque. Ready? First bow. Second bow. Third bow.
Thank you, Dr. Yuen, and to the FCAM board members who are on site to participate in this year's commemoration event. And I'd like to thank all of our guests who are joining us tonight. Next year, we'll mark our 150th anniversary of the 1871 Los Angeles Chinese Massacre. I hope that you continue to follow us and support CAM so you can join us in next year's milestone events. On behalf of the CAM's board and staff, I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight on this somber occasion. Please enjoy the rest of the evening. Good night.